people think of the German army during World War II, they imagine tanks rolling through cities, soldiers marching under the swastika, and commanders who served a regime built on hatred and destruction. But history is never that simple. Among those ranks stood one man who defied that dark image, a general who earned respect not just from his own soldiers, but from his enemies as well. His name was Erwin Rommel. They called him the Desert Fox. In the scorching sands of North Africa, where temperatures could kill a man as quickly as a bullet, Rommel commanded German forces with a brilliance that stunned the world. He was a tactician who could turn defeat into victory with a single bold decision. He was a leader who fought alongside his men, not from a comfortable headquarters miles away. And perhaps most remarkably, he was a German general who refused to commit war crimes even when ordered to do so. This is the story of a soldier who served in the wrong war, on the wrong side, yet managed to keep his humanity intact. A man who chose honor over obedience. A warrior who proved that even in the darkest chapter of human history, some lights still refuse to be extinguished. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891 in the small town of Heidenheim in southern Germany. There was nothing extraordinary about his birth. His father was a school teacher. His mother came from a family of civil servants. The Rommels were not wealthy aristocrats with military traditions stretching back centuries. They were ordinary middle-class Germans who valued education, discipline, and hard work. As a boy, young Erwin was not particularly strong or athletic. He was somewhat quiet, even shy. But he had something else. A mind that could analyze, calculate, and solve problems with remarkable speed. He loved mathematics and engineering. His father hoped he would become a teacher or an engineer. But at 18 years old, Rommel made a different choice. In 1910, he joined the German army as an officer cadet. It was during World War I that the real Erwin Rommel emerged. While millions of soldiers sat in muddy trenches waiting for orders that would send them to their deaths, Rommel was different. He led from the front. In the mountains of Romania and Italy, he commanded small units in lightning-fast raids that caught enemy forces completely off guard. He understood something that many generals never learned. War is not just about firepower. It's about speed, surprise, and the courage to take risks. In October 1917, during the Battle of Caporetto in Italy, Rommel led his mountain troops in an audacious assault. With only a few hundred men, he captured over 9,000 Italian soldiers and 81 artillery pieces. His superiors could hardly believe it. For this achievement, he was awarded the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. He was only 26 years old. But what mattered more than the medal was what Rommel learned. He learned that boldness wins battles, that hesitation kills soldiers, that a commander who stays with his troops earns loyalty that no amount of orders can create. These lessons would define his entire career. After Germany's defeat in 1918, Rommel remained in the small peacetime army. He became an instructor, teaching young officers the art of infantry tactics. He wrote a book called Infantry Attacks, analyzing his experiences in World War I. It became required reading in military academies. And one day, a copy of that book reached the desk of Adolf Hitler. Hitler was impressed. He saw in Rommel a brilliant soldier, a man of action, someone who could help rebuild Germany's military might. In 1938, Rommel was appointed to command Hitler's personal security during military operations. It was the beginning of a relationship that would define and ultimately destroy Rommel's life. When World War II began in September 1939, Rommel commanded a panzer division during the invasion of France. Once again, he demonstrated his genius for rapid warfare. While other commanders advanced cautiously, Rommel drove his tanks forward relentlessly, sometimes so far ahead of supply lines that his own headquarters lost track of him. The French and British forces couldn't keep up. In just 6 weeks, France fell. Hitler was delighted. Rommel had proven himself as a master of modern warfare, and soon he would need that mastery in one of the most unforgiving battlefields on Earth. In early 1941, Germany's Italian allies were in trouble. Mussolini had invaded Egypt from Libya, hoping to seize the Suez Canal and expand Italy's empire. Instead, British forces had crushed the Italian army and were advancing rapidly across North Africa. Hitler realized that if the British controlled North Africa, they would threaten Europe's southern flank and control vital Mediterranean shipping routes. Germany had to intervene, and Hitler knew exactly who to send. In February 1941, Erwin Rommel arrived in the port city of Tripoli, Libya, to command the newly formed Africa Corps. He was given a simple mission: stop the British advance and stabilize the front. But Rommel was not the kind of man who settled for defense. Within weeks of his arrival, he was already planning an attack. His subordinates were shocked. They had only a small force, 2 divisions against a much larger British army. Their supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, where British ships and aircraft attacked German convoys constantly. Military doctrine said they should dig in, wait for reinforcements, build up strength. But Rommel had learned in World War I that sometimes the boldest move is the right move. In March 1941, Rommel launched his first offensive. The British, expecting the Germans to remain defensive for months, were caught completely unprepared. Rommel's panzers swept across the desert like a sandstorm. Towns fell one after another. Within weeks, Rommel had driven the British back hundreds of miles, recapturing almost all the territory Italy had lost. It was during this campaign that Rommel earned his legendary nickname. British soldiers, struggling to understand how this German commander seemed to appear everywhere at once, to predict their every move, to strike from unexpected directions, began calling him the Desert Fox. The name spread quickly. Even Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, spoke of Rommel with a grudging respect. "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and may I say, across the havoc of war, a great general." But what made Rommel truly exceptional was not just his tactics. It was how he led. Most generals commanded from headquarters far behind the lines, studying maps and issuing orders by radio. Rommel refused to do that. He drove to the front lines daily, often in the middle of battle, to see the situation with his own eyes. His soldiers would suddenly see their commanding general's car appearing through the dust and smoke. He would jump out, assess the situation in minutes, and give new orders on the spot. This personal leadership created something rare in any army: genuine devotion. Rommel understood the desert in ways his opponents didn't. He knew that in this vast, featureless landscape, mobility was everything. Tanks were not just weapons. They were the key to survival. He developed tactics specifically for desert warfare: rapid flanking maneuvers, false retreats to draw enemies into traps, sudden night attacks that left British forces surrounded by morning. He moved his forces like a chess master, always thinking 3 moves ahead. The siege of Tobruk became one of his greatest challenges. This port city, held by Australian and British forces, stood as a fortress deep behind Rommel's lines. For 8 months, from April to December 1941, Rommel tried to capture it. Wave after wave of German attacks crashed against Tobruk's defenses. The defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that if Tobruk fell, all of Egypt might follow. Rommel admired them for it. He later wrote that the Australians defending Tobruk were among the finest soldiers he ever faced. When the siege finally lifted and British forces relieved Tobruk, Rommel didn't see it as a humiliation. He saw it as proof that courage and determination could overcome superior force. By 1942, the campaign had become a deadly dance across the desert. Rommel would advance, the British would retreat, then supplies would run out, and Rommel would have to fall back. The British would counterattack. Back and forth, victory and defeat, like waves on a shore. Thousands of men died in this barren wilderness fighting for stretches of sand that held no value except their position on a map. In June 1942, Rommel achieved what many thought impossible. He captured Tobruk. The fortress that had held out for 8 months fell in a single day. Rommel took 35,000 prisoners and massive amounts of supplies. Hitler, overjoyed, promoted him to field marshal. At 50 years old, Rommel was the youngest field marshal in German history. But this victory would be his last. What separated Erwin Rommel from other German commanders was not just his tactical brilliance, it was his character. In an army that served one of history's most murderous regimes, Rommel stood apart. He refused to execute prisoners. He ignored orders to kill Jewish soldiers and civilians. When the SS, Hitler's elite security force, sent officers to Africa with plans to implement the same genocidal policies being carried out in Europe, Rommel sent them away. He told them that in his command, soldiers would behave like soldiers, not murderers. There are documented cases of Rommel treating captured enemy officers with respect and courtesy. He ensured that wounded prisoners received medical care alongside his own men. British officers who were captured often remarked with surprise that they were treated according to the Geneva Conventions. In one famous incident, Rommel personally intervened to stop German soldiers from shooting captured British commandos, insisting they be treated as prisoners of war. Why did he do this? Perhaps because Rommel understood something that ideologues never grasp, that the enemy is also human, that today's foe might be tomorrow's friend, that wars end but what you do during them echoes forever. His soldiers loved him for this, not because he was soft. Rommel was demanding, strict, and expected absolute discipline, but because he was fair. He never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When supplies were scarce, he ate the same rations as his troops. When water was limited, he drank from the same bitter wells. When the heat was unbearable, he was out there in it with them. British soldiers who fought against Rommel developed an almost mythical respect for him. They told stories of his brilliance, his daring, his honor. In the middle of a brutal war, facing an enemy who represented a regime built on hatred, they found themselves respecting the man trying to kill them. That is perhaps the strangest tribute any general could receive. But Rommel's honor would become his greatest burden. By October 1942, everything had changed. The British had replaced their commanders and sent a methodical, careful general named Bernard Montgomery to Egypt. Montgomery understood that he couldn't outmaneuver Rommel. Few generals could. But Montgomery had something Rommel didn't: unlimited supplies, fresh troops, new tanks, and total air superiority. At El Alamein, a small railway station in Egypt, the two armies collided in what would become the decisive battle of the North African campaign. Rommel was already in trouble before the battle began. His supply lines across the Mediterranean were in ruins. British aircraft and ships sank German transport vessels faster than they could be replaced. His tanks ran on fumes. His soldiers were exhausted, and Rommel himself was sick. Desert diseases had weakened him severely. Montgomery attacked on October 23, 1942, with nearly twice as many men and 3 times as many tanks as Rommel had. British artillery fired over 1 million shells in the opening bombardment. The sky lit up like daylight. The ground shook as if the earth itself was tearing apart. Rommel fought brilliantly, moving his limited forces to plug gaps in the line, counterattacking where he could. But brilliance has limits. When your tanks have no fuel, when your soldiers have no ammunition, when enemy aircraft bomb you constantly and you have no planes to defend yourself, tactics can only delay the inevitable. After 12 days of savage fighting, Rommel received an order from Hitler: hold your position to the last man. Do not retreat. For perhaps the first time in his career, Rommel disobeyed. He knew that staying meant the total destruction of his army, men who had followed him across 2 years of desert warfare, who trusted him with their lives. He ordered a retreat. Thousands of his soldiers were saved because of that decision. Hitler was furious, but by the time his rage reached Africa, Rommel was already gone. The retreat from El Alamein became a fighting withdrawal that lasted thousands of miles, all the way across Libya and into Tunisia. Every day, British forces pressed forward. Every day, Rommel's army grew smaller, weaker, more desperate. By May 1943, the Afrika Korps ceased to exist. The survivors surrendered. The North African campaign was over. Rommel wasn't there to see it. He had been recalled to Germany months earlier. Hitler still valued his military genius, assigning him to inspect and strengthen the coastal defenses of France against an expected Allied invasion. But the war had changed Rommel. He had seen what happened when an army ran out of supplies, when air power dominated the battlefield, when industrial might crushed tactical skill. He had looked into the future and saw Germany's defeat, and he had learned something else. Through contacts with other officers, through whispered conversations, Rommel learned the full truth about what the Nazi regime was doing. The concentration camps, the mass murders, the systematic genocide of millions of innocent people. The regime he served was not just losing a war, it was evil. By 1944, Rommel faced an impossible dilemma. He was a German officer who had sworn an oath to his country. But that country was led by a madman whose policies were destroying Germany and murdering millions. Rommel was a soldier who believed in duty and honor. But what does honor mean when serving an evil cause? In France, preparing for the Allied invasion, Rommel did his best to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, the coastal fortifications meant to stop the coming attack. But he knew deep in his heart that it wouldn't be enough. He had seen American and British industrial power in North Africa. He knew that once they landed in France, nothing would stop them. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. Rommel was away from his post, visiting his wife on her birthday. By the time he returned, Allied forces had already established a beachhead. The liberation of Europe had begun. In the desperate battles that followed, Rommel came to a terrible conclusion. Germany had lost the war. Every day of continued fighting meant more destruction, more deaths, more cities reduced to rubble. He began to believe that the only way to save Germany was to end the war, and that meant removing Hitler from power. A group of German officers were planning exactly that. A conspiracy to assassinate Hitler and negotiate peace with the Allies. Some of these officers approached Rommel. The historical record is unclear about how much Rommel knew or agreed to, but his name became associated with the plot. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded in Hitler's headquarters. Hitler survived, injured but alive. The conspirators were hunted down, arrested, tortured, and executed. Under interrogation, one of them mentioned Rommel's name. Hitler was shocked. Rommel, his favorite general, the hero of North Africa, the man he had personally promoted to field marshal, was part of the conspiracy. He couldn't believe it. But the evidence was there, mentioned by multiple conspirators. Hitler faced a problem. If Rommel was arrested and put on trial, it would become public that Germany's most famous general had turned against the regime. It would damage morale. It would raise questions. Better to handle this quietly. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen, Germany. Rommel had been wounded in an Allied air attack and was recovering. The generals brought him a message from Hitler. He was accused of treason. He had two choices. He could face a public trial where he would certainly be found guilty and his family would suffer the consequences. Or he could take poison, receive a state funeral as a hero, and his family would be protected. Rommel knew there was no real choice. A trial would destroy his family. His wife would be arrested. His son would be persecuted. Everything he had fought to protect would be lost. He said goodbye to his wife and son, telling them he would be dead in 15 minutes. He climbed into the car with the two generals. They drove a short distance away. One of the generals handed him a cyanide capsule. Rommel took it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel died on October 14, 1944. He was 52 years old. The Nazi regime announced that he had died from his wounds suffered in the air attack. He was given a state funeral with full military honors. Hitler sent a wreath. Thousands of Germans mourned the death of their greatest general. Only a handful of people knew the truth, that he had been murdered by the regime he once served. Erwin Rommel's story is one of the most complicated legacies of World War II. He was a brilliant general who fought for an evil regime. He won great victories that prolonged a terrible war. Yet he also refused to commit atrocities when others obeyed without question. He served Hitler faithfully for years, yet ultimately turned against him. He was a product of his time and his country, yet somehow managed to remain human in an inhuman war. After the war, when historians began examining the record, they found something remarkable. Of all the major German commanders, Rommel stood out. No evidence exists of war crimes committed by troops under his command. In North Africa, prisoners were treated according to international law. The Holocaust's machinery of death never reached his armies, partly because he wouldn't allow it. British Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, who fought against Rommel, later said, "He was a great general. He had the respect of his men and of his enemies. If more German generals had been like him, the war might have gone very differently." Perhaps that's Rommel's real legacy, not the battles he won or lost, but the proof that even in the darkest times, in the worst wars, in the most evil regimes, individuals can still choose to act with honor. That duty to one's conscience can coexist with duty to one's country. That even when you find yourself on the wrong side of history, you can refuse to participate in its worst crimes. The desert that made him famous is still there, vast and unchanging. The sands have long since covered the tank tracks and trenches. The soldiers who fought there, British, German, Italian, Australian, are mostly gone now, their stories fading into history books. But the memory remains of a general who fought with brilliance and honor, who treated enemies with respect, and who ultimately died because he chose humanity over obedience. Erwin Rommel died as a soldier who refused to surrender his honor even when ordered to do so. His story remains a reminder that even in war, even in the service of evil, there are those who still choose to be human. In the end, that may be the only victory that truly matters.